and hate their own governments.
Then what's interesting, if you just look at the governments, the Israeli, British, and American governments, there's a widespread suspicion that these governments are engaged in a conspiracy against the rest of the world. Again, not the German, not the Russian, or anyone else. And
how long has that been going on?
That's been going on for at least a century. Well, not in the case of Israel, but Britain and the United States. Britain is the first, the United States, and then Israel. It's a 20th century phenomenon. Then what happens is that the inhabitants of these various countries, Israelis, Britons, and Americans, absorb these ideas themselves. And what you have uniquely among Israelis, Britons, and Americans is a suspicion that their own government is engaged in a worldwide conspiracy. And you have the development of an adversarial culture, be it on left or right, be it the militiamen on the right or the weathermen on the left. People who see the jackboots of the American government everywhere and see it as a force that not only wants to repress Americans but take over the world. It's very strange and very limited to the three countries which are suspected of being conspirators.
When did you become a conservative?
I always have been. My political education was in college. I was in college from 1967 to 71. Harvard, the years of rage and revolution. And I thought they were mistaken. And taking that position, arguing against the radicals, was my political education. I was all the time wondering why I'm in this tiny minority that's against the revolution.
What's your father's politics?
Not too different from mine.
How much impact did he have on the way you think?
Well, again, you know, it's no doubt he had impact, but at the same time, there were many other fathers whose politics were similar to mine, and their children were radicals. So I'll take some credit for not having been wild-eyed about the place of America in the world. And
who are either your favorite conservatives in history or contemporary, for that matter, or your favorite? What's your theory of conservatism? I mean, like traditionalist versus social versus libertarian?
I'm somewhat on the libertarian side of things. My impulse is to have minimal government. I think so many of the problems of the 20th century have resulted from a government that's too large and too powerful. In fact, one of the books I quote at some length in Conspiracy is a book by Rummel called, actually I can't remember the name of the book, but it's about the role of governments in killing people, their own people, throughout the 20th century. He comes up with the figure of some 170 million people killed by their own governments, not in war, not by opposite governments, but by their own governments. I think that's the great tragedy of our century. I think what we've been learning from this century is that government needs to be restrained. And in that sense, I'm a conservative.
Follow anybody in particular that history of conservative thinkers?
Oh, some of my teachers, in a sense, would be Friedrich von Hayek and Sir Karl Popper, both from brilliant analysts.
Did you know Hayek at Chicago?
No, I didn't. No, neither of them.
I wrote down the numbers. 169 million in the 20th century killed. Soviet Union, 62 million. Chinese, 35 million. Nazis, 21 million. Chinese nationalists, 10 million. Japanese, 6 million. And the Khmer Rouge, 2.4 million. What's that say about anything?
Well, this figures into my book because what I found is that genocide, the mass killing of people, invariably includes a conspiracy theory. The only way in which a population could be mobilized to murder millions of people is by seeing them as vermin, by seeing them as non-human. And that in turn requires a conspiracy theory. It requires pushing them outside of humanity, seeing them as an evil force that's determined to take over. We know best the Nazi case, where the Jews and some other peoples, Slavs, were put in that position. But it also applies to the communists and other nationalists who rely on conspiracy theories to turn the opponent into a non-human who must be killed.
You've got conspiracy theorists on the right and on the left, and I just wrote a bunch of them down. On the right you have Hitler, Mark of Michigan. Farrakhan. Was Lindbergh on the right?
Yeah.
Conspiracy theorist?
I'm not sure.
Then you say on the left, Pierre Salinger, Gary Sick, Noam Chomsky, Ramsey Clark, Gore Vidal, Oliver Stone, Susan Faludi, the Bolsheviks, Lee Harvey Oswald, Lyndon LaRouche, Harding Carter, Seymour Hersh, Robert Perry, Christopher Hitchens. Some of those are recent and probably don't think of themselves as being conspiracy theorists.
Well, a couple points. First, I'd want to separate out Hitler and Stalin from people working in current America. They are special cases, but I think they are very important as the paradigm of what a conspiracy theorist can become, ruler of his country and someone who dominates his country and possibly can dominate the world through the vision of a conspiracy. Second point would be that the right tends to be, the far right, the hard right, tends to be very explicit about its conspiracy theories, talks about them, whether it be Hitler or the American far right. The left is far more subtle. And perhaps the best illustration of this is Stalin, who was maniacally conspiracy-minded. And yet he somehow rather fooled everyone, to the point that it was only 3 years after his death, when Khrushchev gave his famous speech in 1956, that the party and then the world became aware of what Stalin had been up to. And so, too, in American life, the right tends to be crude and overt in its conspiracism. The left is elegant and sophisticated and subtle. And so take Noam Chomsky versus Mark of Michigan. Mark of Michigan is a janitor by day, and he has loudmouth ravings. Noam Chomsky is one of the brilliant intellectuals of this century, a man who changed our understanding of the human mind, a fluent polemicist who's written book after book on important subjects. Sophisticated is an understatement, and yet his view of the United States government is as conspiracist as Mark of Michigan. So there is this mirror imaging on the two sides, and yet the left gets away with a lot more, in large part because of the elegance with which it pervades its conspiracy theories.
Seymour Hersh, what do you think of him?
I don't remember actually including him in the book as a conspiracy theorist.
Well, maybe it's not fair to say he was a conspiracy theorist, because I wrote down you have other leftists. You call Harding Carter a leftist, Seymour Hersh, Robert Perry, Christopher Hitchens. Oh,
I see. You're making reference to the October surprise. This was a theory that became prominent in 1991 when Gary Sick took a full page in the New York Times to argue that candidate Reagan back in 1980 had conspired with the Iranian mullahs to keep the American hostages in Tehran so that Jimmy Carter would be humiliated and Reagan would win the election. Some 10 years later, 1991, Gary Sick offered this conspiracy theory, and a whole lot of people jumped on it and said this must be true. It turned out not to be true. It was clearly not true, even before looking at the evidence, but the evidence made it all the more certain that it wasn't true. And yet it was a classic example of the left trying to delegitimate a conservative. Reagan's position as president was challenged in this rather circuitous way by these left-wing former aides and others who didn't like him.
No truth to any of it?
No truth whatsoever, no, none.
How many years did you serve in the Reagan State Department?
I was just there for one.
1 year?
1 year.
Why did you do it?
I did it because I was interested in seeing what life is like in Washington in the State Department.
What was it like?
Well, I don't know that I learned anything terribly surprising, but as someone who'd always been on his own writing, it was very interesting to spend a little while in the halls of power and see how decisions are made, what the Washington culture is like.
What kind of thing did you do there?
I worked on the Middle East and policy planning primarily, what we should be thinking about and what the larger issues are.
Did you come away with any new view of government and how it works?
Well, the major point that I came away with that's relevant to our topic today is that how chaotic it is, how who knows who, how important that is, and how unideological so much of it is, and how a position like policy planning is almost an oxymoron. I mean, you don't plan policy, it just happens as things spin out. And that the conspiracy theorists who see some grandiose plan being affected by the government are just completely off base. It's just, it's a chaos. It's a chaotic institution, and never manages to see something several chess moves ahead in the way that the conspiracy theorists imagine it can.
Who does then have power when it comes to international relations?
Well, what's so striking about the United States is the fact that power is well distributed. I mean, we have lobbies, we have Congress, we have the press, we have all sorts of people who are involved in making foreign policy, far more so than the case of other governments, where really the foreign ministry is in charge. Here it's an open process. It's remarkable to see how individuals without money, without credentials, but with a lot of passion and who learn their subject can really make a difference.
You have some little sayings that you write down in the beginning of the book, and one of them is from Joseph Stalin. I trust no one, not even myself.
Yeah, that's a paradigm of conspiracy thinking. It's a literal quote from him. He was an obsessional conspiracy theorist, and tens of millions of people paid the price of their lives for that.
How many did he kill in the end?
Well, you read the figure before. One estimate is something like 60 million. Well, not him alone, but in his time, something in the order of 40 million. The numbers vary greatly, but it's clearly in the tens of millions. People not in war, but within the Soviet Union itself. He is a classic case of someone who was a conspiracy theorist and therefore also a conspirator. Or one can maybe turn around, a conspirator and therefore also a conspiracy theorist. But the web, the connections between the conspiracy and the conspiracy theory are very thick, to the point that as I was trying to understand this, my head would hurt, because where I distinguish between the actual conspiracy and the fear of conspiracy, when you're dealing with an all-powerful ruler, it becomes almost inextricable. When you're dealing with a loner, a conspiracy theorist living in a small farm in Idaho, well, you can easily distinguish between his thinking and what's happening in the country. But when you're dealing with Stalin, who dominated the country to an extraordinary extent, it's hard to make that distinction anymore.
Have you studied him a lot?
Mostly in the context of this book.
What was he like?
He was someone who could disarm his opponents. He didn't come across as someone extremely dangerous. They would let down their guard, and he would cut them off. And he did it time and time and time again. And people were, to the end, unaware of what he was doing.
What was his motive?
His motive was absolute power. His motive was to institute a kind of utopia that he imagined, a utopia in which the communist strictures would be followed as he interpreted them. But power. Anyone obsessed with power sees enemies everywhere, and he saw them everywhere.
You talk quite a bit about two fairly, well, not quite a bit, but enough that I want to ask you about them, two men in history that have big names. Cecil Rhodes, the Rhodes Scholar initiator. What was he in history? Why did you write about him?
Cecil Rhodes was a great colonialist, someone who was eager to expand the British Empire, and someone who had considerable success in finding diamonds and other precious minerals in South Africa. He believed that the British government should expand and was quite overt about it. There are a number of cases. Benjamin Disraeli would probably be the best case.
Who was he?
Benjamin Disraeli was a British Prime Minister in the 50s and 60s, 1850s and 60s. He was a brilliant writer, just generally a brilliant parliamentician, and he would play with conspiracy theories. And he would makes statements in his books, sometimes fictional, sometimes on the floor of the House of Commons, about